Everyone thought it was just another neighborly squabble, a parking spot, a patch of pavement at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. But for me, it was more than that. It was the one piece of ground that felt like mine, my anchor, my proof that I belonged in a neighborhood that never really wanted me there in the first place. The night I came home and found someone else's truck sitting in my space, I didn't think much at first. People make mistakes. Maybe it was a visitor, maybe it was an accident. I told myself to stay calm, to be reasonable. But when I knocked on the door of the new community project office they had set up down the street, the smirks told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't an accident. "Guess you'll have to find another place," one of them said, not even looking at me. "This area's part of our expansion plans now." Expansion, that was their word for it. A polished way of saying they decided my spot wasn't mine anymore. And in that moment, the ground shifted beneath me, because they weren't just taking a parking space. They were trying to take my dignity, my place, my right to stand on the road I had lived on longer than most of them. But here's the thing, they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know the history. See, long before their committee formed, long before the first community improvement flyer showed up in my mailbox, that little stretch of asphalt had a story. It wasn't just concrete poured by the city. It was part of a deed tied back to the very first surveyor maps. Maps, my records, the kind of quiet proof that sits in a folder for years until someone's bold enough to challenge you. I didn't tell them that night. I let them believe I was just another resident too scared to push back. I let them think they had won. But as I stood there looking at that truck in my space, my hands clenched so tightly the keys dug into my palm, I made myself a promise. I wasn't just going to take my spot back. I was going to remind them who owned the road they were standing on. It's funny how people mistake silence for weakness. For weeks, they had whispered about me in board meetings, laughing at the fact that I kept to myself, that I didn't show up at their potlucks or sign their petitions. To them, I was invisible. But invisibility has its advantages. You hear things. You notice the cracks in their stories, the arrogance in their plans. And sometimes, silence is the strongest weapon you can carry. The next morning, I walked past their construction signs, the ones they had planted like little flags of conquest. Bright orange, covered in cheerful slogans. Better roads ahead. A stronger community starts here. They didn't look like progress to me. They looked like warnings. Neighbors waved, some awkwardly, some with pity. No one said a word about the truck still sitting in my space. And that silence cut deeper than the theft itself. Because in that silence, I realized how quickly people look away when they think it's not their fight. But I wasn't going to look away. That night I went into the attic and pulled out the old wooden box my father had left me. Inside were deeds, maps, letters, proof of every boundary line, every inch of property he had fought to protect. My hands shook as I opened the faded folders, tracing the ink with my fingertips. There it was, clear as day. The road, the easement, the space, mine. I thought of my father then, a man who never raised his voice but whose quiet determination shaped everything I am. He used to tell me, respect isn't given out like candy. You earn it by standing your ground. And in that moment, I felt him with me. The following day, I parked my car right in front of that truck, blocking it in. I didn't leave a note. I didn't knock on their door. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, staring at the office they had built on false ground. People gathered, whispering, pointing. Some laughed, some shook their heads. But when the project manager stormed out, red-faced, demanding I move, I didn't flinch. "This is my road," I told him, calm, steady, certain. He laughed like I was some child playing make-believe. "Not anymore," he said. "You'll see." But what he didn't realize was that the paper in my hand would shut down everything they were trying to build. And as I turned and walked back toward my house, heart-pounding, I knew this was only the beginning. Because sometimes the smallest piece of pavement can spark the biggest fight of your life. They said I was making a scene. Maybe I was. But what they didn't understand was that sometimes you have to make a scene when the whole world is pretending not to see you. That night I lay awake listening to the crickets outside my window. My car was still parked in front of theirs, headlights dark, body like a shield between me and them. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt a knot in my chest. Because deep down, I knew they wouldn't stop here. People like that never do. They test you inch by inch to see how far they can push before you break. And I wasn't planning on breaking. By morning, flyers appeared on doorsteps. Bright, cheerful words printed over smiling faces. Community progress delayed by one resident. One resident. That's what I had become to them, not a neighbor, not a person, just an obstacle, a faceless roadblock in the way of their vision. I saw the looks on my neighbors' faces as they read. Some avoided my eyes entirely. Others gave me the kind of half-smile you give someone when you're sorry but not sorry enough to stand beside them. That was the part of all realizing that, while I was fighting for something that mattered, they were already calculating which side was safer to be on. I didn't say a word. I didn't knock on doors or hand out my own flyers. Instead, I waited, because sometimes silence makes more noise than shouting ever could. Days passed. Construction equipment lined the edge of the street, idle but menacing like soldiers waiting for their command. And then one afternoon I saw it, a man in a suit, briefcase in hand, walking door to door. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't handing out cookies or flyers. He was gathering signatures. I followed him quietly, just far enough to hear. He was telling people that the road was public, that I was squatting on community property, that my refusal to move was hurting property values. Property values. As if a number on a spreadsheet could measure the worth of a home. As if dignity could be reduced to a decimal point. By the time he reached my door, I was waiting. He introduced himself, smooth voice, expensive watch glinting in the sun. He explained their project, their timelines, their legal authority. And then he asked me to sign his petition. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I walked back inside, came out with my father's folder, and laid the yellow deeds across the hood of his car. The ink was faded, but the words were sharp enough to cut through all his polished lies. "This road," I said, tapping the page with my finger, "doesn't belong to your project. It doesn't belong to your committee. It belongs to me." For a moment, he just stared at the paper, his lips twitching like he was searching for the right performance. Then he chuckled, a low sound that wasn't amusement at all, it was arrogance, disbelief. "Do you really think a few old papers can stop progress?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it. Because those papers weren't just ink and signatures. They were proof of every sacrifice, every fight, every quiet act of resilience that had kept that patch of road in my family's hands for decades. He gathered his things, muttering something about legal challenges and outdated claims, but I could see the crack in his confidence. For the first time, they realized I wasn't bluffing. That night, the whispers began. Some neighbors knocked on my door not to help but to warn me. They told me the committee was furious, that they were planning something bigger, that maybe I should think twice before dragging this out. Their words were laced with fear, but underneath it I heard something else. Resignation. People give up too easily. They fold their hands and bow their heads, telling themselves it's not worth the fight. But if you never stand up for something that's yours, do you ever really own it? The next day I drove downtown. The courthouse smelled of dust and old wood, the kind of place where truth hides in the silence between ticking clocks. I requested certified copies of my documents, every map, every deed, every ruling tied to that strip of road. As the clerk handed me the thick stack of papers, she gave me a look I'll never forget. Not pity, not doubt, respect. When I got home, I spread everything across my kitchen table. It wasn't just evidence, it was a weapon. And as I stared at it, exhaustion washing over me, I asked myself one question. How far would they go to take something that didn't belong to them? I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let them decide that for me. Sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest truths, and mine was about to echo down every street in this neighborhood. The first crack doesn't come with noise. It comes with silence. The kind that lingers in the air when neighbors cross the street to avoid you, when conversations stop the moment you step outside. That silence had a weight to it, pressing down on me each time I walked to my mailbox. But silence never scared me. I grew up with it. Long nights where my father would sit at the kitchen table, going over maps by candlelight when the power was cut, too stubborn to ask for help. Silence is where resolve is born. What did scare me was the sound that finally broke it, the rumble of engines. I came home one evening to find bulldozers lined up at the end of the road. Bright yellow, engines idling like predators waiting for the signal to strike. Men in hard hats stood around, clipboards in hand, pointing toward my space as if it were already theirs. My pulse hammered in my ears. They hadn't won, not yet, but they were daring me to stop them. I walked straight toward the project manager, the same red-faced man who had laughed at me the first night. He turned when he saw me, smirk curling across his face. "We've got approval," he said. "City permits, your little papers won't hold up." I didn't shout, I didn't argue. I just held up the certified copies I had pulled from the courthouse. The stamp glistened under the setting sun, official and undeniable. For a second, just a second, his smirk faltered. "Move the equipment," I said quietly, "or I'll make sure the first thing this city hears about your project is that you built it on land you don't own." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so the workers couldn't hear. "You're playing with fire." "Good," I whispered. "Maybe it's time something burned." That night I didn't sleep. The sound of those engines still rattled in my chest, the threat in his voice echoing in my mind. I sat at the table, papers spread before me, tracing the lines over and over. I wasn't just fighting for asphalt. I was fighting for every time someone thought they could laugh at me and get away with it. But the fear was there too. What if they had more power than me? More money, more lawyers, more friends in high places. What if, despite all my evidence, they still took it from me? I thought of my father again, of the way his hands would shake after long battles with city officials, but how his voice never wavered. He used to say, "Power isn't always about who's the loudest. It's about who can stand the longest." And so I stood. The next morning, the bulldozers were gone, parked a few blocks away, silent, waiting. But in their place, a new sign had been hammered into the ground right at the edge of my space. "Road work to begin, authorized by community committee." The words burned. They wanted me to see it every time I stepped outside, a reminder that this wasn't over. And it was. Because 2 days later, I found a notice taped to my front door. A summons. They were taking me to court. I held the paper in my hands, the ink trembling with my grip. Court. A battlefield I hadn't planned for, but one I was ready to face. Because if they wanted to drag this fight into the open, I would make sure the truth echoed louder than their lies. Neighbors whispered as I passed. Some shook their heads like I was foolish. Others wouldn't even meet my eyes. But one old woman down the street stopped me. She leaned on her cane, voice cracked with age, and said, "Don't let them scare you. This neighborhood used to mean something before they came in. Remind them." Her words were small, but they lit a fire in me. I wasn't just standing for myself anymore. I was standing for everyone who had been pushed aside, silenced, erased. The day of the hearing came. I walked into that courtroom with my father's folder under my arm, my heart pounding like a war drum. Across the aisle, their lawyers in sharp suits sat smug, whispering to each other like the outcome was already decided. When the judge called my name, I stepped forward, my voice steady even as my hands shook. I laid the documents on the table, each one a piece of armor, each one a nail in the coffin of their arrogance. And as the room grew quiet, as eyes turned toward the faded deeds that had outlived every one of their shiny permits, I realized something. They hadn't expected me to make it this far. And that was their first mistake. Because I wasn't just defending a parking spot anymore. I was defending the road beneath their feet. Everyone expects the courtroom to be loud. They picture shouting matches, slamming fists, dramatic objections. But the real battles, they're quiet. They happen in the way a lawyer smirks before speaking, the way a judge arches a brow, the way a single piece of paper lands on a table with a weight you can feel in your chest. That's what it was like that morning. No chaos, just tension thick enough to choke on. Their lawyer started first, smooth, practiced words rolling off his tongue. He spoke about progress, about the community, about how one resident couldn't stand in the way of shared growth. He gestured toward me without even looking at me, like I was an empty chair, a shadow. And then he said it. "She's clinging to outdated documents, relics of a time long gone. What matters now is what benefits the community as a whole." Outdated relic, words meant to erase me. I felt the sting, sharp and hot, but I didn't let it show. I waited, let him circle around, building his tower of lies higher and higher, brick by brick. Because the higher he built, the harder it would fall. When it was my turn, I stood. My knees trembled, but my voice didn't. I laid out the deeds, the surveys, the signatures, layer after layer of truth. I didn't try to match his polish. I spoke simply, plainly, like my father would have. "This road has a history," I said, my eyes locked on the judge. "And history doesn't disappear just because someone decides it's inconvenient." For a moment the room was silent, truly silent, the kind that makes you wonder if anyone is breathing, and in that silence I felt something shift. The lawyer wasn't smirking anymore. The judge was leaning closer, reading the documents with sharp eyes. But then came the turn I didn't see coming. They introduced a witness, A city planner, young, eager, wearing the confidence of someone who thought they held the winning card. He carried a stack of permits, stamped and sealed, declaring the road public property under the new development plan. My heart sank because I knew how it looked. Shiny, official, recent. Against my faded deeds, they looked like the future swallowing the past. For a moment, doubt clawed at me. What if the judge believed them? What if all my preparation, all my father's records, weren't enough to stand against the machinery of a system designed to forget people like me? But then I remembered something my father told me when I was a child, sitting on that same stretch of pavement. The truth is stubborn, it waits, and when the lies collapse, it will still be standing. So I stood taller. I cross-examined the planner myself. No fancy lawyer, no polished words, just questions. Simple, sharp, relentless. Have you read the original survey maps of this neighborhood? No. Do your permits include the easement clause filed in 1953? I'm not sure. Are you aware that your entire development plan is built on land that was never ceded to the city in the first place? His confidence cracked. The papers in his hand suddenly looked less like proof and more like props. The judge took notice. So did the crowd behind me, neighbors who had filled the benches out of curiosity but were now leaning forward, listening. When it was over, the judge didn't rule that day. He said more research was needed. More time, more evidence. To them, it might have felt like a delay. To me, it was a victory, because every day they didn't break ground was another day my father's road still stood. But victories come with consequences. That evening, I found my mailbox stuffed with anonymous letters. Some were polite, urging me to think of the neighborhood. Others were cruel, spitting words like selfish and obstacle. One, scrawled in angry ink, said, "We will take it whether you like it or not." I held that letter in my hand a long time, not because of the threat, but because of the truth underneath it. They weren't fighting for progress. They were fighting for control, and control doesn't compromise. I knew then that the courtroom was just the beginning. Because when people are desperate to own what isn't theirs, they'll stop at nothing. And as I sat alone at my kitchen table, letters spread out like battlefield markers, I asked myself the question I didn't want to answer. Was I ready for how far they might go? The first rock hit my window just after midnight. It wasn't loud, just a sharp crack that jolted me awake. I sat up, heart pounding, staring into the darkness outside. At first I thought it was kids, some prank. But when I turned on the porch light, I saw it. A note wrapped around the stone, scrawled in the same angry handwriting as the letter I had pulled from my mailbox days before. Stop fighting, last warning. I stood there barefoot on the porch, the night air cold against my skin, clutching that stone. For a moment I felt small, alone, like the weight of this fight was pressing me into the ground. But then I looked down the street at the construction signs, at the office they had built on what was mine, and I felt the fear harden into something else. Resolve. Because threats mean one thing, you've rattled them. The next morning I called the police. I showed them the note, the stone, the letters. They nodded, took a report, and drove away. That was it. No patrols, no promises, just paperwork. I realized then that no one was coming to save me. If I wanted to win, I would have to stand alone. And yet not completely alone. Because that same afternoon, as I was sweeping glass from the porch, the old woman with the cane shuffled up the walk. She didn't say much, just pressed a tin of cookies into my hands. "You're stronger than you think," she whispered. Then she turned and left. Her words stayed with me. Stronger than I think. Maybe she was right. But strength isn't just about standing tall. It's about standing when you're tired, when your hands shake, when your knees threaten to buckle. And I was tired. The committee had money, lawyers, influence. All I had were old deeds, stubbornness, and a heart that refused to back down. The court hearings dragged on. Each time their lawyers arrived with new arguments, new papers, new faces to parade as experts. Each time I countered with facts, with history, with truth. The judge listened. He asked questions. He requested more documentation. It was a slow grind, a war fought inch by inch. But outside the courtroom, the war looked different. Neighbors stopped waving. Some wouldn't even make eye contact. A few muttered insults under their breath as I passed. They wanted the new road, the new project, the promise of higher property values. To them, I wasn't a protector of history. I was the enemy of progress. That isolation cut deeper than any insult. Because home isn't just walls and pavement, it's belonging. And every day they chipped away at mine. Still, there were small glimmers of light. The old woman's cookies, a quiet nod from a neighbor I barely knew, even the clerk at the courthouse who slipped me a copy of an old zoning map with a whisper. This might help. Little things, but little things can carry you when the world feels heavy. One night I sat on my porch watching the streetlights flicker against the empty asphalt. I thought about walking away, about letting them have it. Life would be easier, quieter. No more letters, no more rocks, no more courtroom battles. But then I thought about my father, about the nights he spent at that same kitchen table, refusing to let the city erase what was his. He hadn't fought so I could surrender. He had fought so I could stand taller than he ever did. And so I made a choice. If they wanted a fight, I would give them one they'd never forget. The next day I filed my own motion, not just to defend my space but to challenge the legitimacy of their entire project. It was risky. If I lost, I would lose everything. But if I won, I wouldn't just take back my spot, I'd shut them down completely. When the committee found out, I saw the shift in their eyes. No more smirks, no more casual laughter. Now there was anger, real anger, because they realized I wasn't playing defense anymore. I was coming for them. And as I walked home that night, past the half-finished signs and idle bulldozers, I felt it for the first time. The tide was turning. Because sometimes, it only takes one person willing to stand in the storm, to remind everyone else that the road doesn't belong to those who scream the loudest. It belongs to the ones who never move. The look on their faces when the judge accepted my motion is something I'll never forget. For weeks, they had walked into that courtroom with the swagger of people convinced they couldn't lose. But when the judge leaned forward, eyes sharp, and said, "This case now includes the question of the project's legitimacy," their confidence cracked like glass under pressure. And that sound, the silence that followed, was the sweetest thing I'd heard in months. I didn't celebrate, not outwardly. I sat there calm, steady, letting them think my stillness was indifference. But inside, my heart thundered, because this wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. This was about the foundation of their entire plan. If I proved my claim, the road wasn't just mine. Their project was illegal. Every sign, every bulldozer, every dollar they'd poured into it would collapse like a house of cards. Of course, they didn't take it quietly. That night, new flyers appeared, plastered on mailboxes and taped to lampposts. "Don't let one person destroy our future." They painted me as the villain now, the selfish neighbor clinging to the past, dragging the whole community down. I tore one down and crumpled it in my fist. The paper felt flimsy, weak, lies usually are. But lies spread fast. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. I didn't want to go, but I forced myself to walk through those double doors. Eyes turned. Conversations hushed. I could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on me. The project manager stood at the front, arms folded, face redder than ever. "We cannot allow one resident to dictate the future of this neighborhood," he declared, his voice booming. "We must stand united." United, it sounded noble, but all I heard was the word obedient. When they opened the floor, I rose to speak. My voice shook at first, but steadied as the words left my lips. "This isn't about the future, it's about the truth. And the truth is this road doesn't belong to your project, it belongs to me, and no amount of posters or speeches will change that." The room erupted, shouts, jeers, mutters of support mixed with anger. Some neighbors clapped, others booed. But I stood my ground, letting their noise wash over me like waves against rock. Because the louder they screamed, the more I realized they were afraid. Afraid that one person with nothing but paper and persistence could bring their empire crashing down. Back in the courtroom, their lawyers doubled their efforts. They tried every trick, delays, technicalities, even questioning the authenticity of my documents. Each time I answered with proof. Certified copies, notarized signatures, surveyor maps older than anyone in that room. Piece by piece, I chipped away at their walls. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Buried deep in the zoning archives, in a file no one had bothered to read in decades, I found it. A ruling from years ago affirming that the strip of road in question had never been transferred to public ownership. It wasn't vague. It wasn't unclear. It was black and white, signed and sealed. When I slid that paper across the courtroom table, their lawyer went pale. For the first time, he had no words. The judge studied it carefully, lips pursed, eyes narrowing. Then he looked up. "This changes everything." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. But victories like that don't come without a cost. The very next day I found spray paint across my fence. Bold red letters, "Get out." I stood there staring at the words, paint dripping down the wood like blood. My neighbors walked by, pretending not to see, their silence louder than the insult itself. For a moment I felt the sting of defeat. Was this worth it? The isolation, the threats, the constant fear that the next attack wouldn't just be paint or paper. But then I thought of my father, of that old road, of every time they told me I didn't belong, and I realized something. They weren't trying to scare me into leaving. They were trying to scare me because they knew I was winning. So I picked up a brush, painted over the words, and stood taller than I had before. Because sometimes, the more they push you down, the more the ground beneath your feet becomes yours. And as I looked down that street, at the project that was crumbling piece by piece, I knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, it wasn't just mine anymore. It was theirs to lose. It started with whispers. At first, they were faint, tucked away in corners of conversations, barely audible over the hum of daily life. But soon, those whispers grew louder. Neighbors who once avoided me began to glance my way with uncertain eyes, not friendly, not hostile, just questioning. Because the cracks in their project were no longer invisible, they were splitting wide open for everyone to see. Permits revoked, timelines delayed, rumors swirling about money wasted, contracts pulled. What once looked unstoppable now looked fragile, like a tower of glass in a storm. And in the center of it all was me, one stubborn resident who refused to move. I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted my spot, my piece of road, my dignity. But sometimes the fight you choose grows larger than you ever imagined. The tension in the neighborhood became impossible to ignore. Yard signs appeared overnight. Support progress in bright blue letters, protect our streets in bold red. A civil war of cardboard staked into lawns, dividing neighbors who once shared barbecues and block parties. One evening, as I carried groceries from my car, a man across the street shouted, "You're destroying this community." His voice cracked, not with anger but desperation. I almost shouted back, almost told him he was wrong, but then I saw the way his hands trembled. It wasn't just rage, it was fear. Fear that the promises they'd been sold were slipping away. That's when I understood. The committee wasn't just stealing land. They were stealing hope. They had convinced people that without this project, the neighborhood had no future. And now, as that illusion shattered, people didn't know what to believe. But truth has a way of speaking louder than fear. At the next court session, the judge ordered a temporary halt to all construction. My evidence had raised serious questions, he said, about the legality of the project. The room went still. Then the murmurs began. Not everyone understood the details, but they understood this. The project wasn't untouchable anymore. When I walked out of the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved in my face. "Are you the woman stopping the road project?" one asked. I froze. I wasn't ready for that spotlight. I wasn't looking for fame, but the words slipped out anyway. "I'm not stopping progress. I'm protecting what's mine." The clip spread fast. Suddenly, I wasn't just the quiet neighbor at the end of the street. I was a story, and stories have power. That night, for the first time in months, there was a knock at my door that didn't come with threats. It was a young couple from down the block. They looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot, but their voices were steady. "We just want you to know we believe you. We've seen what they're doing. If you need witnesses, if you need statements, we'll help." I almost cried right there in the doorway. Not because their support changed everything, but because it reminded me I wasn't as alone as I thought. Still, not everyone was ready to switch sides. The committee doubled their propaganda. They called emergency meetings, shouting about how I was ruining lives, how the whole neighborhood would suffer because of me. But the more they shouted, the more desperate they looked. And desperation never wears well. Then came the night that changed everything. I was walking back from the courthouse when I saw a crowd gathered near the project office. Voices rose, heated, angry, neighbors shouting at the committee members, demanding answers, demanding to know why so much money had been spent without proper approval, why they hadn't been told the full truth. And in that moment I saw it, the shift. The committee wasn't untouchable anymore. The community they claimed to represent was turning on them. I didn't step forward. I didn't need to. I just watched as the fight I had carried alone for so long began to spread, rippling outward like cracks in glass. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, but with that came a new kind of fear, because people who are losing power don't let go quietly, and if the committee was cornered, I knew they would come at me harder than ever before. As I stood under the streetlight, watching the shouting match grow, I asked myself the question that had haunted me from the beginning. What price would I pay to win this fight? The answer was coming, and it was closer than I wanted to believe. The morning of the final hearing, the air felt heavier than usual. Clouds hung low, gray, and unyielding, as if the sky itself understood the weight of what was about to happen. I walked into the courthouse clutching the same folder I had carried since the beginning. The edges were frayed now, corners bent, papers worn soft from too many hands. But inside was everything, every map, every deed, every fragment of truth that had survived longer than the lies stacked against me. The committee sat across the aisle, stiff in their suits, faces pale with tension. Their lawyer avoided my eyes. The smirks were gone. The swagger had evaporated. They looked like people who knew the tide had turned but were still praying for a miracle. The judge called us forward. His voice was steady, measured, but there was something final in his tone. Their lawyer argued first. He tried to dress the project in noble words: progress, growth, opportunity. But his voice cracked when he spoke, the desperation seeping through. Even he knew the shine was gone. Then it was my turn. I didn't speak with fury. I didn't shout. I simply laid down the last piece of evidence, the zoning ruling I had uncovered from decades ago. Clear, undeniable, a document that said in no uncertain terms that the road was mine. This isn't about stopping progress, I told the judge, my voice steady even as my hands trembled. It's about protecting what belongs to me, what has always belonged to me. No project, no committee, no promise of money or influence can erase the truth. The judge leaned back, silent for what felt like an eternity. The room was still, every breath held, every eye locked on him. And then, with a final nod, he spoke the words that ended it all. The court recognizes the property rights of the plaintiff. The contested road, including the space in question, is not subject to the committee's project. Construction is to cease immediately. Silence, heavy, suffocating silence. And then, like a dam breaking, the room erupted. Gasps, murmurs. The committee members huddled together, faces red with disbelief, while neighbors whispered in shock. I didn't smile, I didn't cheer. I just exhaled, the weight I had carried for months finally lifting from my chest. It was over. When I stepped outside, the air smelled different, fresher, lighter. Reporters rushed toward me again, shoving microphones and cameras into my face. But this time I had only one thing to say. Sometimes the truth just needs someone stubborn enough to stand with it. And then I walked away. The days that followed were strange. The bulldozers disappeared. The signs came down. The office they had built on false ground was quietly dismantled, piece by piece, until nothing remained but empty pavement. The same pavement my father once stood on. The same pavement they tried to steal. Neighbors were divided. Some avoided me still, unable to forgive me for stopping what they believed would have made their lives easier. But others, quietly, cautiously, began to nod, to wave, to thank me for holding the line when no one else would. The old woman with the cane brought me another tin of cookies. This time she smiled. "You reminded them," she said softly. "You reminded all of us." At night I sat on my porch staring at my reclaimed spot. Just a strip of asphalt, ordinary, unremarkable, and yet it carried more weight than anything else I owned. Because it wasn't just about a parking spot. It was about dignity. It was about refusing to be erased. It was about proving that one person, standing alone, can still hold back the tide when the tide is wrong. The road was quiet again now. No bulldozers, no signs, no shouts of progress or whispers of threats, just silence. But this time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like peace. I know there will be other fights in other places with other names and other faces. There always are. People will always try to take what isn't theirs, to silence the ones they think won't fight back. But maybe, just maybe, this story will remind someone else that silence isn't weakness, that the truth is stubborn, that sometimes the smallest piece of ground can be the place where everything changes. Because at the end of the day, respect isn't given by committees or stamped on permits. It's earned by standing your ground. And as long as I'm here, standing on this road, no one will ever take that from me again.